All right, it looks like the number of participants is pretty stable, so I'll start our introduction. So just a reminder, don't worry if you can't see yourself in the Zoom. This is a webinar, so all attendees are going to be automatically muted with their videos off. So you're only going to be able to see the panelists and me. I'm the moderator. My name is Lisa. I'm the 1L engagement rep for Land, Air, Water this year. Throughout the panel, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function, and we are going to answer all the questions at the very end. And then there's going to be a Google or a form where you, if you'd like to donate to the Friends of Land, Air, Water, which gives out summer stipends to law students who are working at public interest firms. So our first speaker is going to be Neil Lawrence from the Natural Resource Defense Council, and Neil is a senior attorney at the NRDC, and he filed the petition that led the creation of the screens, and we'll discuss the history of the effort. Rob Clavins from Oregon Wild and is next, and he's the Northeast Oregon field coordinator for Oregon Wild, and will speak about the current attack on the screens. Third, we will hear from Paula Hood from Blue Mountain Biodiversity Project. Paula is the co-director of the Mountain Biodiversity Project. She will demonstrate what is at stake with the potential rule change by sharing real-world examples of where USFS has recently logged large and old trees in Eastern Oregon. And fourth, we will have David Mildrix from Eastern Oregon Legacy Lands based in Joseph, Oregon. David has a PhD in forest ecosystems and society. He has published peer-reviewed research on climate implications of the rural proposal and will speak to the values of the large trees in Eastern Oregon. Thank you, and let's get started.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me say, on behalf of all of the panelists, we greatly appreciate the work that you put into to make this possible. This is a totally crazy year to be a 1L, and to have fit this in on top of everything else is really, really impressive. So just many, many thanks from all of us. I am going to take you guys through a little presentation here that kind of gives you a lightning quick history of the East Side screens. Lisa's going to tell me if you're not seeing my PowerPoint. Hearing nothing, I'm going to charge ahead. To understand the history of the East Side screens, you have to know a little bit about the history of federal lands logging in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. The pivotal event there was the passage of the GI Bill in the wake of World War II. It meant that returning veterans all had access, well, unfortunately, not all of them, but many of them had access to subsidized loans that let them buy houses. It led to an enormous boom in the housing industry, and with it, a tremendous increase in the demand for lumber. It came at a time when private industrial timberland owners had largely depleted their stocks all the way to the Pacific Ocean, some of them for a second time. And the upshot was a tremendous increase in the cut that came off of national forests. To accommodate that volume, much of the cut was done by clear cutting when it had been selective logging in the past in a lot of places. And it didn't take too long for the clear cutting to start to have really serious and obvious bad effects on national forests that were used and loved by people across the country. By the late 60s, a real backlash had developed against those clear cuts. People ultimately turned to the courts, and by 1973, in a lawsuit brought by the predecessor organization of Earth Justice and also a lawyer at NRDC, a case called the Monongahela case, because it arose out of practices in the Monongahela National Forest. a federal judge found that the very law, the 1897 law that authorized the Forest Service to sell trees from the National Forest, that law required that the sold trees all be individually marked. The upshot of that was it was an immediate end to clear cutting on national forests. Nobody could produce that kind of volume by going out there and painting each and every tree. When that case went up on appeal, the Fourth Circuit agreed with the district court that the plain language of the statute required marking of individual trees, and it understood that this was a big deal, that this was going to create a big backlash. But it said, in essence, that Congress wrote that language, and if there's going to be different language, Congress is going to have to write that. It didn't take long for Congress to act. That's a 1975 decision. By 1976, towards the end of the year, Congress passed the National Forest Management Act. And the National Forest Management Act did a bunch of different things, but maybe at its core and most familiar to those of you who work on national forest issues, it required that management on individual forests be according to plans for those forests, land and resource management plans developed through a public process that would include a set of safeguards. Now, the trade-off was that the NFMA put the Forest Service back in the business of clear cutting. But it also required that that clear cutting be done under forest plans that were developed according to regulations that included a bunch of resource protections. The core resource protection, it turned out, was one that required that the plans provide for the diversity of plant and animal communities in national forests. But probably more significant from a conservation standpoint was the fairly visionary requirement that Congress inserted that the rules for national forest management plans, the rules that would set those protective standards, those be developed with the advice of an outside committee of scientists, not federal scientists, but outside scientists. And those scientists knew that as a biological matter, you couldn't protect the diversity of plant and animal communities if you started losing species. So when the regulations appeared for the plan in 1982, they contained a key provision popularly known as the Viable Populations Requirements, or VIAPOPs, by people who are really deep into this stuff. And the Viable Populations Requirement mandated that the agency maintain existing populations of vertebrate species. The compromise, of course, was that it didn't include plants and it didn't include inverts. But it required that they not just be maintained, but that they be maintained well distributed in the planting area, which in effect meant that where they currently existed, they couldn't be extirpated. And in addition, there had to be habitat that would allow individual populations to communicate. You couldn't isolate populations. So I don't know that the Forest Service understood what it was agreeing to when it passed that regulation. It didn't take long for it to start running into that regulation head on. And this was a 1982 regulation. By a year later, in 1983, Forest Service biologists were already raising an alarm about the northern spotted owl, an obscure little and somewhat shy forest dweller that really needed interior old growth forests in Oregon and Washington to survive. And by late in the 1980s, activists led by, again, the predecessor to Earth Justice and litigating on behalf of a bunch of Northwestern national organizations had essentially stopped old growth logging in Western Oregon and Western Washington, first and foremost on behalf of the spotted owl. Ultimately, the spotted owl, as you all know, got listed under the Endangered Species Act. That's the law that currently dictates the sort of the outer parameters of management for it. But the initial injunctions, the initial problem came under the viable populations regulation and its effective requirement that the agency not extirpate species from anywhere in a planning area. And the Northwest Forest Plan, the multi-species Northwest Forest Plan that still governs land, still governs logging in Western Oregon and Western Washington. Many of those species were included in that plan because of the viable populations requirement. While activists in the Northwest were working on spotted owls, I and my colleagues in the California office of NRDC were pursuing similar concerns in the Sierra Nevada, partly for the California spotted owl, but also species that it turned out were even more closely associated with the old growth in the Sierra Nevada and more affected by logging there. Fur bears, including the fisher you see here, American marten, and very relic populations of wolverines. That work ultimately led to a moratorium on clear cutting that lasted for many years in the Sierra Nevada. And we did it without filing a lawsuit. We did it by utilizing a provision in the basic law governing how administrative agencies conduct their business and how they relate to the public, the Administrative Procedure Act, which contains a little provision that requires every federal agency to accept petitions from the public for the formulation of regulations or rules. So we petitioned them for a fur bearer rule. While we were doing that, and because of the injunctions on the west side in Oregon and Washington, the industry and the Forest Service set their sights over the crest of the Cascades and started looking for to make up for their lost volume, their lost cut in the east side national forests of Oregon and Washington. That's the hash marked forests you see in this slide. That's 12 million acres of national forests, a lot of real estate. They are very ecologically, as David, I'm sure we'll talk about, they are very, very diverse compared to many forests on the west side. They range from there's still some relatively pure ponderosa stands in the drier flats, many kinds of mixed conifer forests up through pretty dense fir forests, and in upper elevations, larch and pine forests. It is a region of highly varied ecological conditions. It's commonplace to be on a hill on the east side in a stand dominated by ponderosa. Walk 3 minutes around the corner from a west slope into a north aspect and find yourself in pretty dense mixed conifer, where there is a scattering perhaps of ponderosa, but where fir and Doug fir and larch are the dominant species. Very varied population across the region. There are places where the precipitation is less than 10 inches per year, and other places where it's 60 or 70 inches per year. But everywhere it is characterized by 100 years of high grading. The forests there they're not like Doug fir forests. They were not clear cut. They were selectively logged, dating back to the end of the 19th century, first by wagon, then by railroad, and ultimately by modern equipment, in entry after entry after entry, each time the loggers taking the biggest and most valuable trees, which meant mostly the big ponderosa pines. It was commonplace 100 years ago to see ponderosa on the east side of 5 or 6 feet in diameter. Today, 2 or 2.5 feet is a pretty big tree in most places. And along with those many entries, repeated entries, the loggers and the Forest Service left behind an incredible network of roads. Road densities on the east side are on the order in many places 3 or 4 miles per square mile. You just walk a couple hundred yards and you're in another road, with all of the adverse impacts on the ecosystem, soil density, and the riparian zones that those roads bring with them. The the protections that the NFMA regulations produced on the east side were, I think I'm being charitable here, they were pathetic for old growth associated species, and there are a number of them in the east side, and disturbance averse species. The Forest Service settled on putting aside a set of patches according to what they called minimum management requirements for a few identified species. These were little patches of better forest. They were supposed to be the best available forest, but rarely were. And they were inordinately small. They were kind of grotesquely small compared to the actual habitat requirements of the species involved. American marten, for example, were supposed to be protected by little patches of 160 acres set 6 miles apart. That compares with what we now know their home range is for males, ranging up to 4,000 acres. These are species that need cover and need a lot of wood on the ground. Goshawks, one of the more famous old growth associates on the east side, had patches set aside that were 1% of their home ranges. Pileated woodpeckers, a quarter of the size of their home ranges. And there were a number of old growth associates for which there were no MMRs, no habitat set asides at all. Notably the blackback woodpeckers, which are obligates on burnt forests, white-headed woodpeckers that are probably the most selective for open pine forests, and a number of mammals like lynx, wolverine, fisher, which are now rare on the east side, but still existed there, and whose presence there and whose ability to resist extirpation was and remains quite precarious. NRDC learned about these problems, these MMRs and their problems, doing forest plan appeals for the predecessor of Oregon Wild, Oregon Natural Resources Council, and other groups, a national forests in or partly in the east side. We did it sort of the same time that the spotted owl controversy was at its height. And we rapidly discovered that the science on the east side was almost as sparse as the habitat set asides. But we also discovered that there was a lot of ongoing research, much of it being done by people, Forest Service biologists, who turned out to be just great scientists and really courageous staff members. We did not make a lot of headway in the appeals of those forest plans. But we learned about the developing science, and when in 1993, the president announced that he was going to hold a forest summit in Portland to resolve the controversy on the west side, we and a number of other environmental groups directly petitioned the White House to include the east side because of its dire straits, because we could see the industry and the Forest Service moving across the mountains. And to back that up, NRDC drafted what's become to be known as the East Side Petition, which collected the then rapidly emerging science, again, much of it from the Forest Service itself, but from outside academics as well, and a bunch of declarations, made out the case to the agency and directly petitioned it for a set of upgraded MMRs for old growth species, and adding MMRs for species that had been omitted. And most critically, in the meantime, because we knew it would be years before those could be developed, we petitioned for an immediate stop on logging in or near old growth stands, and also an end to road building in roadless areas. I will say that the petition, which I think our sponsors here can put in the chat for you to download, revealed that there was much better science about the precarious state of old growth associate species than disturbance averse ones. And the call for an end to road construction in roadless areas is kind of it's an afterthought at the end of the petition. There wasn't at the time a great deal of science to support it. The Forest Service took the petition seriously. It had been, it was under a shutdown on the west side. It didn't want to be under a complete shutdown on the east side. It talked to its scientists. The scientists said, yeah, that's our work. That's what it says. They're right. The Forest Service checked with Washington and the White House and got the backing to stop, to call a halt to timber sales. They sat down with us. They sat down with the many groups that we represented in the petition. They agreed not to sell timber on the east side until our client groups had taken a look at it and determined whether or not they thought that it would pose a threat to old growth associated species. And there then commenced in the spring and the summer of 1993 an amazingly intense field research effort, field screening effort by environmentalists. This was a time when there were, I don't know, 7 or 8 environmental activists in Eastern Oregon, maybe 5 or 6 in Eastern Washington, but with support from national groups and with my colleague David Edelson and me accompanying them, we went out to literally hundreds of timber sales and looked at them. And in that interim period, when we found, like the picture you see on your screen here, big old growth marked for cutting, the Forest Service simply dropped those units from its plans. That, of course, produced a lot of backlash, and it meant that very little timber was sold. Although there were hundreds of sales that we looked at and agreed did not really implicate old growth species. But in pretty short order, the agency knew it had to follow a little bit more regularized process, and it called its scientists together, and they developed a set of a sort of a rough approximation screens for timber sales that their managers could apply in the field. The basic idea behind these initial screens persisted all the way through and still persists on the east side, and it's a badly flawed notion. The notion is that the agency is able to establish what the historic presence of old growth was across the region, watershed, subwatershed by subwatershed. And then in places where it's in deficit, the agency won't do anything that makes the deficit worse. But where it finds, pockets of old growth at or around what it estimates the percentage of old growth was in settlement times, then it can log that. So it takes a look for what it called the historic range of variability, and where it finds a watershed that it says the old growth is within the historic range of variability, then it can log some of those trees as long as it doesn't push the old growth back out of the HRV. This is a crazy notion because nobody disputes that old growth across the east side is seriously depauperate, depending on the national forest. There's somewhere between 7 and perhaps 14, 15% of the old growth that existed at settlement times there. Where there are pockets that have escaped, where there are still relatively intact blocks of old growth, they are regionally scarce and they should be left entirely alone. But that was the basic idea behind the initial screen. At the same time that the Forest Service was developing those screens in the summer of 1994, an effort that had been started a year and a half earlier by a visionary congressman from Indiana, who went on to be an activist leader, forest activist leader, Jim Johns, commissioned a study by a bunch of scientific societies that focused on natural resources, the American Fisheries Society, Society for Conservation Biology, Wildlife Society, and so on, into the state of Eastside National Forests, their history, their current state, their biophysical conditions, and conditioned a set of recommendations. There are a dozen recommendations in this report. It's a wonderful report, an incredible piece of work by the scientific societies. But what turned out to be the key recommendation was that pending development of a regional ecosystem management strategy, there ought be no logging of large trees. And large trees here meant anything over 20 inches in diameter of any species, or 150 years of any species, and any more dominant or codominant ponderosa pine, the species that had been most prevalent and most heavily logged. They also called for riparian protections, no more entry into wilderness areas, restrictions on grazing, mining, and so forth. While they were doing that, the timber industry was getting its knickers in a twist over the screens. They went to court. They filed a lawsuit that challenged the interim screens on the basis that they really amounted to forest plan amendments. They needed to go through a forest plan amendment process and be accompanied by NEPA. They convinced a federal judge in Eugene that they were right. He directed the Forest Service not to use the screens anymore until they had been through that process. That kind of cut off the industry's nose to spite itself, because that meant there were no timber sales until they got the amendment done. When they did the amendment, it was an amendment to forest plans across the region. It was still centered on this notion of HRV, but critically, it included a set of wildlife screens, requirements for corridors and snags and some foraging areas for goshawks and so forth. But it adopted a version of the Scientific Society's recommendation. They jacked the limit up to 21 inches from 20 inches, just scrabbling for a little bit more timber. But green sales throughout the region were limited to trees 21 inches and below. And environmentalists spent the next year doing field checks to make sure that limit was enforced. The screens also included riparian protections, responding to petitions filed by other environmental groups because of viability concerns for salmonids, both seagoing and freshwater, and they had environmental assessments. There were two such screens. The first one was a little more rigorous. After 9 months of experience with that, the region adopted a second amendment, which included more exceptions that played out badly over the next 20 years on the east side. But the core requirements still remained in there, that as a baseline proposition, on one hand, areas that were depauperate in old growth couldn't lose any more old growth, and green sales at least had to respect a 21-inch DBH limit or invoke an exception.
Hey, Neil.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to do a quick time check. This is really good information.
I am done. I'm on my next to last screen.
Okay, great. Sounds good. I didn't want you to skip anything, but wanted to make sure we could get.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see from my watch that I've run a couple minutes over here. So let me jump. Let me wrap quickly. They were upheld, and they, until January, were the law of the land. The outgoing Trump administration, as you'll hear, amended them to allow for logging of non-ponderosa species over 21 inches in limit. They were meant to be interim screens while the agency developed a regional ecosystem management plan. That plan grew to include the upper reaches of the Columbia Basin. It became very unwieldy, very slow-moving. Never got adopted in the Clinton era. When George W. Bush came into office, the Forest Service dropped it. It never emerged, as most of you know. But what remained were the trees over 21 inches, and they are very largely still there. Here's a shot from last month. I skied up into the Okanagan, on the east side of the Cascades in the Okanagan, into a lovely stand of ponderosa pine up there. And if you look at the tree in the foreground, you can just make out a diagonal blue stripe here. That tree of Doug fir was marked to be cut when the east side petition hit the fan and the logging stopped, and it and many of its fellow large trees remain there to this day. So with that, let me hand off the talking stick.
Okay, hopefully you can see that pretty picture of Eastern Oregon and hear my voice. And I assume somebody will yell at me if they can't. Yeah, I appreciate that, Neil, and sorry to to cut you off there at the end. No, it was really good information, and I really learned a lot from it myself. So folks know my name is Rob Clavins. I'm the Northeast Oregon Field Coordinator for Oregon Wild. We're a state-based conservation organization whose mission is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for future generations. I'm based near the town of Enterprise, where my wife and I own and operate a working farm and bed and breakfast. This part of the state is truly a landscape of superlatives with the deepest canyon in North America, the most complete assemblage of wildlife in the state, and also the largest protected wilderness. So it's no wonder to me that the Nimiipuu or Nez Perce tribe never gave up their claim to this place after living here since time immemorial and no less than 16,000 years. Yeah, I really appreciated hearing that history from Neil. You know, we hear a lot about spotted owls and the Northwest Forest Plan, but the screens were no less significant in both slowing the unimpeded destruction of our forests and creating the conditions where stakeholders in the agency could start to build some degree of trust and common ground. Unfortunately, though, instead of finishing the job, the Forest Service chose this year to gut one of the most, or if not the most meaningful protection for large and old trees in the region. As Neil shared, the screens were initially created to protect wildlife habitat, and it did that well. Large trees, living, dying, and dead alike, are incredibly important for wildlife. In fact, where I live, there are several dozen species identified as being limited primarily by the lack of that large structure, especially the dead stuff like snags and down woods that the agency generally sees as nothing but fuels, and the industry likes to call zombie trees. And you know, competition between for wildlife between wildlife for those trees can be really intense. And you know, species that use them include woodpeckers to bats, all the way down to important but often overlooked invertebrates. And we also shouldn't forget the important role that large living and dead trees play in keeping common species common, like bear, grouse, and flying squirrels. However, like so many other bedrock environmental laws, it did a great deal more than what may have been initially intended. Protecting these big and old trees on public lands also helps maintain soil health, clean cold water for fish, wildlife, and human values. And then large trees also provide shade that keeps forests wetter longer and cool at the micro level, which is increasingly important in the age of undeniable climate change. And while there are measurable ecological and economic benefits from maintaining and promoting the full life cycle of large trees, I think it's important not to overlook the spiritual and cultural values that these trees provide that may be harder to quantify, but are no less important. And also the screens have played a key role in our collective ability to find common ground and build fragile trust between and among stakeholders and public agencies. It's a lot harder to do that when we're fighting the old fights about whether or not to log the last of the big and old trees. And I know David is going to talk more about this, but as we face the dual climate and biodiversity crises, it's important to note the role that Eastern Oregon forests play in providing a connectivity corridor of continental importance, and the role that they can play in sequestering carbon if maintained, or the role that they can play in exacerbating the climate crisis if they're cut and turned into saw logs or burned for energy. What I hope you take away here is that no one really debates two key facts. One is that large and old trees are incredibly important, and number two, that they are sorely lacking in Eastern Oregon. So in the absence of the comprehensive protections that the Forest Service promised decades ago, the screens are still sorely needed. As you can imagine, extractive industries generally view environmental protections as impediments to easy profits. And as you can imagine, the logging industry never liked the screens or any limit on cutting big and old trees. So they turned largely to private lands here. And as they're liquidating those forests on private lands, they and extractive-minded sympathizers have begun turning their eyes to our public lands and using lots of different justifications, usually restoration, safety, fuels, but it's still all about largely cutting trees. And thanks to misinformation from the industry, polarized politics, and sort of the mythologies of the rural-urban divide, there's long been pressure to ditch the screens. So, you know, attacks on the screens are nothing new. There have been several efforts by politicians to get rid of them over the years. In particular, in 2004, folks like Tim Lilbo, Brett Brownscombe, and Rick Bailey led the charge along with brave champions within the agencies working for them. And those efforts never really abated. And more recently, industry and ideologues found their champion in Greg Walden, who we understand in his lame duck term took the fight over the screens all the way to the Oval Office, personally asking President Trump to give him a, quote, win on the screens as part of his legacy. So starting about a year ago, we started seeing evidence of really stunning pressure put on Forest Service leadership to undo the screens and to get it done fast with collaborators. The agency began working with collaborators, including far-right politicians and a few token conservationists, while cutting out the majority of the conservation community and even Senators Wyden and Merkley before rolling out a process to the broader public. What it did was make really clear that the process had a predetermined outcome from the start. And that's something that actually Forest Service personnel have privately confirmed to us on multiple occasions. And if you want something, to get something controversial and destructive done quickly, you do exactly what the Forest Service and the Trump administration did. You skip key parts of public process like scoping. You don't do an environmental impact statement, and you create a rapid, which is to say rushed scientific assessment that just simply brushes aside any science that doesn't support your predetermined outcome. And all that's made worse when you do most of that during the early stages of a pandemic, an economic crisis, and historic levels of social unrest. The process that the agency put together was really an embarrassment. They tried to check the box of public engagement by doing things like holding a scientific panel in which the independent scientists that they invited slammed the agency's own cherry-picked science. They invited tribes to weigh in on Indigenous Peoples Day when tribal staff were not working. And they blatantly defied their own internal memos on how to conduct and whether or not to conduct such work during the pandemic and the other ongoing crises. And all along the way, despite the evidence, the agency publicly insisted this had nothing to do with political pressure. And I think at best they were being naive, and at worst they were being incredibly dishonest with themselves and the public. And all of that was ultimately laid bare when 2 business days before the Biden administration took office, a Trump political appointee took the decision out of the hands of the region, signed the decision, and cut off any additional opportunity for the public to weigh in as had been publicly promised all along. All of that took about 5 months. In the end, the public had exactly 1 opportunity to formally comment on a hugely consequential rule that affects over 14,000 square miles of incredibly diverse landscapes of the Fremont, Wainema, Deschutes, Ochako, Malheur, Umatilla, and Wallowa-Whitman National Forests. That's less public process than even the most non-controversial small timber sales that the Forest Service routinely puts out. And it isn't just process or politics. Make no mistake, the conservation community, including Oregon Wild, we pushed back early and we pushed back hard, but we also participated in the process in good faith and at every opportunity we had, and we remained open to being proven wrong. In the end, though, the substance is just as bad as the process, and it arguably exceeded most of our worst fears. The Trump administration eliminated protections for many trees under 30 inches in diameter and 150 years old. And for all the other large and old trees, regardless of species, they changed what was a strong enforceable standard into an extremely squishy guidelines that includes language like the intent is, as much as possible, should retain, generally emphasize. It actually kind of reminds me of the Subway sub advertisements that say something like, whenever possible, we try to source our ingredients from the best sources we possibly can. And we've already seen timber sales in development start to include using the Trump screens. And what we've seen is truly horrifying on the ground, and it's in direct opposition to what the agency and nominal conservation supporters of the decisions said that the agency would do with any additional discretion. We've also seen industry and industry supporters lean on the Forest Service to apply the Trump screens anywhere and everywhere, even retroactively. And one thing that's scary is that it also has the potential to make industrial logging in the backcountry profitable again, just as we're coming to agreement that the work we really need to be doing should start with thinning near homes and communities and then work their way out from there. And the other thing I think that's really important to note is that the good work that we generally agree the Forest Service should be doing can be accomplished without this change. So in addition to the usual suspects, support for the Trump screens decision has come from 1 or 2 token but strident and unapologetic conservation and science voices. And unfortunately, that's given an easy out to otherwise good leaders to stay silent on the matter. But it's important to contextualize that support. And I can count it as coming from less than half the numbers of the fingers I have on one hand. And that stands in really stark contrast to over 100 independent scientists who called the proposal misguided. One of the scientific experts cited by the Forest Service as an expert early in the process co-wrote his own exhaustive report on the science that the agency ignored and brushed aside. Former leadership of the Forest Service has opposed the effort, along with dozens of conservation, climate, indigenous, wildlife, public health, and other organizations, including all of the place-based conservation groups in the area. It's also led to further devolvement and marginalization of Eastern Oregon collaboratives. And as a quick aside, that's a topic we'll be covering on a panel on Sunday morning that I hope you'll consider checking out. And while I don't speak for the tribes, we believe the agency ran afoul of some serious sovereignty issues and tribal rights. So when the Trump appointee took the decision out of the hands of the region, he also took away the public's last chance to substantively weigh in outside the courtroom. And despite rhetoric from anti-environmental voices who like to tell folks what we're about, we really don't want to go to court. So we're pleased that the Biden administration gave us one final off-ramp with his climate executive order that requires review of decisions like this. So a number of organizations have been reaching out to the new administration, asking them to review and withdraw the decision. We're also calling on Senators Wyden and Merkley to make the same request, because by their own criteria that they've laid out, they should absolutely be opposed to this decision, and we need them to engage again. And whether the Trump screens are withdrawn by this administration or we prevail in court, we stand ready to work with the Forest Service and stakeholders, so long as we're all on equal footing from the beginning, and that it honors the promises they made 2 decades ago, recognizes the incredible diversity of Eastern Oregon forests, is meaningfully informed by all of the best available science, and is guided by 21st century conservation values. So with that, I want to turn it over to Paula, who will talk about what's at stake and what we've seen the Forest Service, how we've seen the Forest Service use its discretion in the past.
Rob, I think you have to stop sharing your screen. So hello, everyone. My name is Paula Hood, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm co-director of Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, and we're a small grassroots nonprofit that works to protect and restore the natural ecosystems of the Blue Mountains and Eastern Oregon Cascades on the Deschutes, Ochako, Malheur, and Umatilla National Forests. Field surveying is the backbone of the work that we do, and we field survey all the major timber sales within our work area. We've been active and out in the field in Eastern Oregon since 1991. And today the focus of my presentation is to provide a cautionary view based in large part on our field experiences. So as you heard from Rob and Neil, there's still a well-documented deficit of large trees in the region. The 21-inch screens have only been in place for approximately 25 years. Large and old trees have not had time to recover to anywhere near historic levels at that time. And it's also important to note that mixed conifer forests and moist mixed conifer forests are often targeted for logging, with grand fir trees being the most targeted for large tree logging. Unfortunately, many of the forests that are slated for logging often include old, moist, and riparian forests, and some that have never been logged or only minimally logged. These forests are often providing some of the best or only remaining large tree structure and high quality wildlife habitat in those areas. And in many cases, they're surrounded by tree plantations, usually young ponderosa pine stands that are homogeneous and lacking in snags and other key wildlife habitat. Many species depend on large trees specifically, regardless of the age of the trees. Notably, an internal 2015 Forest Service memo on forest plan amendments admitted that large, old, hollow grand fir are crucially important to species such as black bears, faux swifts, pileated woodpecker, American marten, and bats. The agency stated that, quote, large, hollow grand fir are rare on the landscape and have declined from historical conditions on the east side of Oregon and Washington. The memo also noted that large hollow firs take 150 to 200 years to develop, and that adequate numbers of small trees are of course needed for these large trees and stacks to develop. Also, a huge multi-year study with dozens of scientists in the mid-90s found that there's been a 27% decline in multi-story old forest structure compared to historic conditions. That was from Quigley in 1996. So I want to highlight here that essentially the Forest Service has replaced a standard that was put in place specifically to protect wildlife with a guideline that instead focuses on silviculture. And the guideline does not consider nor does it prioritize the needs of wildlife. So let's see, next slide. Recent logging on the east side, especially in mixed conifer forests, regularly includes logging of large fir trees and, to a lesser extent, large ponderosa pines. To be clear, logging of large trees has been happening right along. It's been in a piecemeal fashion basically since the screens were implemented in the mid-90s. The Forest Service has repeatedly attempted to avoid the East Side Screens protections by illegally using site-specific forest plan amendments. But in 2014, in the Snow Basin case, a district court ruled against the agency's use of this practice and determined that the agency was violating existing standards and that their analysis and consideration of important ecological conditions was inadequate. Unfortunately, some Forest Service districts have continued to use this loophole to log large trees despite the court ruling. So I'm going to jump in, dive into a couple of examples of timber sale case studies that include large tree logging. I want to note that the Crow timber sale, which is recently proposed on the Malheur National Forest, includes logging of large trees on approximately 8,000 acres, with logging of large ponderosa pines proposed for 3,000 of those acres. And so to me, this illustrates that while the agency focuses its public outward messaging on logging large fir, they're clearly targeting large ponderosa pines as well. And BMBP field surveyed the Crow's timber sale last summer, and a couple of key takeaways from our field surveys was that logging is planned for moist mixed conifer forests, some of which are at higher elevations and on steep slopes. And some of these areas have never been logged or only very minimally logged in the past. Other areas that are slated for large tree logging have been repeatedly logged, with large trees now comprising almost entirely what is left after this repeated past logging. And so this sale provides a preview of the rampant overlogging of large trees, including large ponderosa pines. And then here on this next slide, there's more pictures from the Crow timber sale. Note the already very open forests. The Forest Service generally justifies these sales ostensibly for fire risk reduction and manipulation of tree species composition. Unfortunately, the Forest Service tends to greatly oversimplify their approach to mixed conifer forests and largely glossing over key issues as well as over crucial differences between dry forests and moist forests. I also want to highlight here that removing through logging the complex multi-story canopy structure within mixed conifer forests, either by logging the large trees or by logging in the understory, also removes key wildlife habitat for many species. And so said another way, the very forest structure that the Forest Service calls fuels is the very same structure that many species rely on for habitat. So another example is the Morgan Nesbitt sale in the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. And these are a couple pictures from Morgan Nesbitt. Here in the picture is an example of the diameter and age of a cord tree in the sale. The project area for the sale is 87,000 acres and runs right up to the boundary of the Eagle Cap Wilderness. It includes unroaded landscapes and places that have been proposed for wilderness and wild and scenic river protections. The area also includes thousands of acres of Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. It's part of a wildlife corridor of continental importance. The area also has moose, elk, wolverine, salmon, wolves, recent fisher sightings, and is near recent confirmed grizzlies just on the other side of the Idaho border. And this area is where wolves returned and reestablished themselves in Oregon. So the final example I want to talk about is the series of back-to-back sales in the Middle Fork of the John Day River watershed. Taken together, the Austin, Big Mosquito, Camp Lick, Ragged Ruby, and Magoon sales include over 50,000 acres of commercial logging in recent, current, and proposed sales. And so that's not project area, that's commercial logging. All have been proposed within the past 7 years. All but one of these sales includes large tree logging, and several of them include thinning within streamside riparian habitat conservation areas. Yet the Forest Service failed to conduct basic cumulative impacts analyses for species such as Mid-Columbia River steelhead, which are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Repeatedly, the Forest Service simply concluded that because an individual sale would affect only a relatively small percentage of the habitat across the entire forest, then the effects from that timber sale would be insignificant at the scale of the forest. However, the agency repeatedly failed to consider the effects of these sales when taken together. So essentially, the agency failed to, at a bare minimum, simply sum do the simple step of summing the amount of affected habitat in these back-to-back sales, either at the forest scale or at the watershed scale. And so this is one of the many examples showing that there's a serious issue with the failure to take cumulative impacts seriously. Logging of large trees, especially in combination with logging in streamside corridors, will harm watershed hydrology and stream and fish habitats, as well as wildlife that depend on mature and old complex forests and large tree structure. And so streams are very near and dear to my heart. I did my master's research focused on forested streams. And so I can't help but share some additional details on water quality and fish in these sales. So the Big Mosquito, Camp-Lick, Magoon, and Ragged Ruby sales together potentially affect almost 30% of mid-Columbia River steelhead habitat on the Malheur National Forest. And that doesn't include the Austin sale or the recently proposed Bark sale, both of which are planning thinning within streamside corridors. And some of that thinning in the corridor may be commercial logging. And so these would almost surely also affect a as yet unidentified portion of steelhead habitat on the forest. So approximately 1/3 of mid-Columbia River steelhead habitat on the forest will potentially be affected, and almost certainly more with the Austin and Bark sales. Yet the Forest Service has failed to look at the cumulative impacts to this threatened species. And the same or similar analyses issues exist with other species such as red band trout, bull trout in the sales where they occur, Columbia spotted frog, and Pacific lamprey. And of course, just a reminder, this is an estimate from recent projects on the Middle Fork of the John Day from the past 7 years. So there are many other projects that have taken place in this watershed in prior years. And so streams regularly reach temperatures which violate water quality standards and are limiting or potentially lethal to imperiled fish. And in addition, there are problematic issues with inconsistent or inaccurate data in the Forest Service NEPA analyses for these sales. Freedom of Information Act data that BMBP obtained from the Forest Service showed that many of the streams within these sales have substantially higher stream temperatures compared to what the Forest Service reported in their NEPA timber sale documents. So here on the slide, there's some examples comparing stream temperature data from the Forest Service NEPA documents to those that BMBP obtained through FOIA. So we examined stream temperature data for streams within several of these timber sales, and we compared the timber sale NEPA data, the FOIA documents, and data from Norwest online database where the Forest Service said they obtained stream temperatures for Ragged Ruby. And we found over 20 streams that either had higher stream temperatures than those that the Forest Service disclosed in their timber sale NEPA documents, or the Forest Service actually had stream temperature data they did not include in their timber sale documents. So, and some of these creeks are slated for commercial logging within their streamside corridors and are designated critical habitat for mid-Columbia River steelhead. The state temperature standard is about 60.8 degrees Fahrenheit, while some of these creeks regularly reach stream temperatures of over 70 degrees. And this isn't isolated. The more that I dig into these data, the more that I found the same or similar issues. Here on the map, you can see streams with water quality limited and impaired waters in Eastern Oregon. And this, of course, includes many streams on the national forest. So how are these water quality problems relevant to the issue of large tree logging? Well, for one, I think that this is yet another example of the Forest Service failing to see the forest ecosystem issues through the trees, so to speak. In other words, they're prioritizing tree species composition and logging large trees at the expense of other ecosystem values, in this case, water quality and fish habitats. I also think that the agency's lack of accountability on crucial problematic issues does not bode well for the future of these ecosystems, especially with increased large tree logging directly on the horizon. Another issue is that the Forest Service can't have adaptive management if they do not have accurate baseline information, or are unable to collect and store data in a consistent, accurate, and transparent manner. Also, you simply cannot provide for imperiled fish recovery if you do not have large wood structure in the streams, and also a strong supply of large wood into the future. Given the ongoing deficit of large trees, taking more of them off the landscape simply does not make ecological sense. And also, as Rob mentioned, the rollback of protections of large trees will incentivize logging in the backcountry, pushing it even further into more remote areas. So, sales are often not profitable unless larger trees can be logged. And with the rollback of these protections, it will become more economically viable to build or repair roads and go further distances into the backcountry in order to log large trees in areas that previously may not have been profitable. And of course, you can't have timber sales without lots of roads. And the further into the backcountry logging is pushed, the more that ecologically damaging roads are built and rebuilt. Roads are ubiquitous on national forests in Eastern Oregon. For example, both the Malheur and Wallowa-Whitman National Forests each contain over 9,000 miles of existing inventoried roads. Both of these forests currently have existing road densities at levels that are recognized as threats to water quality, fish, and watershed health, and that exceed forest plan standards in many areas. And also, these forests are the only ones in the country that have not completed travel planning as required under the 2005 final rule for travel management. Roads are one of the primary threats to water quality and fish on national forests in the region. With increased logging of with increased large tree logging, the footprint and the intensity of these negative impacts will increase on the landscape. And make no mistake, logging in Eastern Oregon is widespread on the forested landscape and already has a large footprint. Here you can see the timber sale projects on the Malheur National Forest, for example. The cross-hatching depicts NEPA decisions that have already been signed, and then the other colors show sales proposed in 2019 to 2023 and beyond. Note that when this map was made in 2019, 37% of the Malheur National Forest was under current signed NEPA decisions, and sales in 2019 to 2023 will markedly increase that already very large figure. So here, similarly, you can see that the Wallowa-Whitman planning area outside of the Eagle Cap Wilderness is generally covered by recent, current, or near future timber sales. And this map shows project planning areas for the Ochako, Malheur, Umatilla, and Wallowa-Whitman National Forests. So to wrap up, instead of engaging in larger ecosystem planning with a holistic view, the Forest Service is narrowly focusing on prioritizing tree species composition as an overarching goal, rather than focusing on wildlife, water quality, and other key ecosystem components or values, or on how critical large trees are for all of these values. The Forest Service needs to withdraw their decision to roll back protections for large trees, and they should instead put in place larger ecosystem planning that prioritizes protection for large trees, mature and old forests, water quality, unroaded areas, wildlife, and other key ecosystem values. Because there's still a clear widespread deficit of large trees, every tree out there is very important right now, and they need to be protected, not logged. And with that, I'm going to give it over to David. David, you're on mute.
All right. How am I looking? Can you see my first screen? Okay. Thank you, Paula. Always sobering to see some of the pictures of projects on the ground. And I thank you for being out there and doing all the work to look at this stuff really out there on the ground. I start with this just beautiful picture of Joseph Canyon, named after Joseph of the Nez Perce tribe, chief of the Nez Perce tribe. Just to remind everyone of the 16,000 years of indigenous culture here in this landscape, and just the incredible, beautiful nature of this landscape here, our shared homeland, Joseph Canyon with its tributaries reaching up to the Zumwalt Prairie and the snow-capped peaks of the Wallowa Mountains. It's truly a remarkable, diverse ecoregion and place that we live. And there's a lot we can gain by protecting places like this that are so resilient. The title of my talk is Global Change, Big Trees, and Climate Mitigation in Eastern Oregon. My name is David Meldrexler, and I work as systems ecologist for Eastern Oregon Legacy Lands, and we run the Wallowa Ology Discovery Center in downtown Joseph, Oregon. Today, it is more critical than ever that we understand the Earth as a holistic system because our impacts are feeding up to challenge the resilience of the entire planetary system. For example, from the International Space Station, look how thin the atmosphere is. The bulk of the atmosphere is about 6 miles thick. And it is here that nearly all weather occurs and 99% of the water vapor is found. That distance on the ground is quite nothing. We drive that just from Joseph to Enterprise. And today we are simply filling up the atmosphere with carbon emissions. And it's very important to recognize this because we can have clean water and clean air in our local environments and make progress in restoring these things, but at the same time ruining the entire climate of the Earth system. And that isn't going to work out very long. Here's what those measurements look like of filling up the climate system with carbon dioxide. The red up and down seesaw line is the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, the actual measurements. And the black line is the running mean measured at Mauna Loa here in Hawaii, shown in the background. These measurements were started in 1958 by Charles David Keeling, a person I had the pleasure of meeting when I was at the University of Montana. And so we often think about resilience. We think about it for the individual species, and we might think about it for the ecosystem, but it's time we think about it for the whole planet. We've completely moved out of the Holocene now into what's called the Anthropocene. And I like this, this surface model here because it shows the entire Earth in it. And you can see just how we are heading towards big planetary thresholds that lead to things called the hothouse Earth, where there's no getting out. And this type of trajectory is incredibly dangerous for the Earth's ecosystems and for human society. Put simply, we will not be able to thrive under these conditions as a society, and there will be massive disruptions in the Earth's biosphere. This model also shows that there's still time to get to a stabilized Earth, but look how challenging it is. You can see that this is a very difficult situation, but it's also a message of hope. Science says there's still time to avoid the worst impacts and get to a stabilized Earth. And I think that's very important to share with people who are increasingly concerned about climate change. We really have to take collective human action now. It's got to be a holistic effort. And it's not just climate change we're pushing up against. We are pushing up against numerous planetary boundaries, as shown in the central model that comes from the Stockholm Resilience Center: biodiversity, nutrient loading of the biosphere, land system change. All of these things we're pushing up against simultaneously, and climate change threatens to exacerbate numerous of these things. And so, it's our future generations that are going to be trying to keep balance in this world that is rapidly changing, and we've got to do everything we can to help them out. And forests are doing a lot right now. They're actually taking up about 30% of the emissions that we put into the atmosphere. That's remarkable to think about. And the temperate forests are taking up a lot of carbon, so they're central here in the fight against climate change. And the other part of this is that there's a lot of emissions associated with logging. In fact, as globally, it's one of I think the second largest source of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and the single largest in the state of Oregon. So by doing improved forest management, you not only can protect and store more carbon in the ecosystem, you avoid these emissions into the atmosphere. And that is a critical part of the natural climate solutions framework. It's not just the storage and the sequestration, it's the avoided emissions as well. And in this story, we find out that these large trees are playing this incredibly disproportionate role. Inequality is normal, they say, and dominance of the big trees. The largest 1% of trees in mature and older forests comprise 50% of forest biomass worldwide. That's really an incredible statistic to think about. And that the rate of tree carbon accumulation increases continuously with size really kind of flipped the paradigm on its head that said that these large trees weren't really doing much for productivity anymore, but in actuality they are. So they're not only accumulating carbon still quite rapidly, they're also storing the most carbon in the system. So when you think about the disproportionate role that they're playing and help us achieve these natural climate solutions, it's really, really important. We've heard about the 21-inch rule today. I have worked in monitoring many projects on the ground as well, which is, as I mentioned, always very interesting. The 21-inch rule gives people a chance to just engage in a lot of issues in reality. Here was a timber sale on the left I came to, where you can see that most of the trees under 21 inches were removed, which takes a huge amount of carbon from the ecosystem already. And then in this project, they were going to remove a lot of the trees with the black paint. Those were over 21 inches that were protected in a previous project. So I really started to wonder how much carbon is being taken out of these stands now that we're going to, if we start using this as a model for landscape scale planning. Not to mention, you know, I just saw all that solar radiation hitting the forest floor, the lack of snags, the lack of downed woods. These trees are really what remains of the forest community in this area. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me to cut them down to favor these tiny seedlings in the foreground. As already mentioned, Eastern Oregon's forests are incredibly diverse. I grew up on the west side, and living in Northeast Oregon is remarkable because we get this incredible precipitation through the Columbia River Gorge, and lots of snow comes into the Northeast ecosystems. We have mountain hemlock forests. We've got big spruce wetland forests. And then there's also these very dry systems, ponderosa pine and juniper systems. So you just look at the forest type groups across all of Region 6, Oregon and Washington, and there's nothing as diverse as the East Cascades and the Blue Mountains put together. It's a remarkable and diverse region. And we've known it stores a lot of carbon, and the Blue Mountains, as you can see here, they don't have as high as density of some systems, but there's just so much area that it adds up, and they end up storing a lot of carbon. So it just hints to me at how important it is that we manage these systems well. When you put the Blue Mountains and the East Cascades together, you're talking about a very critical part of Oregon's policy on how our region is going to interact and engage with climate change in terms of our forest management. But, you know, we've never known the role of large trees in these systems, which brings me to my study. I had the pleasure of working with some outstanding scientists, and I just want to acknowledge them and their work in helping me take this study to such a high level. This map from our study, Figure 1, shows the area including the 6 national forests covered by the east side screens, and it includes data from a recent study that mapped out forest carbon priority ranking across the western US. They found that east side forests included substantial area of medium and high rank for their ability to store and accumulate more carbon over the coming century. This caught my attention thinking about the carbon value of these large trees. This study measured the physiology of trees and measured combustion components and fluxes post-fire on 6 fires in the region to come to this conclusion that these forests have outstanding potential to store additional carbon. And here are my study questions. How does above ground carbon storage change with tree diameter among the dominant east side tree species? How common are large trees across the east side forest by species, and what proportion of each species' total above ground carbon do they account for? What are the potential consequences on carbon stores of widespread removal of large trees in east side forest restoration projects? We analyzed forest inventory data collected on all of the forest inventory and analysis plots across these national forests, totaling 3,335 plots, to develop the most robust estimates to date of large tree populations and carbon stores across these forests. Throughout this study, it has struck me on numerous occasions just how fundamental these questions are to making any kind of informed decision on large tree management across Eastern Oregon. And here's looking at how above ground carbon storage changes with tree diameter among the dominant east side tree species. Note we evaluated 5 tree species that exist across a broad range of biophysical environments. The overall relationship shows that across these 5 dominant species, as diameter increases, there's a rapid accumulation of above ground carbon. Note that the dashed line represents a 21-inch diameter tree, and you can see as a tree becomes larger than that threshold, accumulation and continues to grow larger, tree above ground carbon accumulation really takes off. So you can see that the Eastside screens have done a good job of protecting trees that are not only storing a lot of carbon, but then after this period really start storing more and more quick. There are some variations between the 5 species as they get larger, but generally speaking, it's the same fundamental principle that large trees store a lot more carbon than small diameter trees. In fact, doubling tree diameter from 10 to 20 inches led to a 5 to 6-fold increase in above ground carbon. Tripling the tree diameter from 10 to 30 inches led to a 14 to 18-fold increase in above ground carbon, with the largest increase observed for ponderosa pine. One of the most effective ways to visualize this is to think of adding a ring of new growth to the circumference of a large tree with a huge trunk and its branches every year. This ring adds up to a lot more carbon than the ring of a small tree. And this is why trees are able to accumulate so much more carbon as when they grow larger, and why letting forests grow, and specifically letting large trees grow larger, part of a strategy called proforestation, is so important for climate change because it maintains the carbon stores in the trees and accumulates more carbon out of the atmosphere during the critical period from now to 2030 and on to 2050 at a very low cost. Here's looking at our second study question: how common are large trees across the Eastside forest by species, and what proportion of each species' total above ground carbon do they account for? The charts in the bottom left-hand corner are summarized in the table above. You can see below that overall, about 3% of the trees are over 21 inches diameter, and they count for about 42% of the above ground carbon across these forests. Ponderosa pine had 3.7% of trees over 21 inches, the highest for any species, and 45.8% of above ground carbon stored in those 3.7% of trees. A grand fir had 2% of trees over 21 inches, the lowest for any species, but accounted for 38.4% of total species above ground carbon. Other species are provided here, Douglas fir at 3.7% and so on. We also wanted to look at trees over 30 inches because that's an important criteria for the proposed amendments. And you can see that as we go up to this diameter, trees become quite rare on the landscape. Now we're talking overall, only 0.6% of trees are over 30 inches on the landscape, yet they account for 16.6% of the above ground carbon. Note that Western larch, grand fir, Engelmann spruce are all at only 0.4%, Douglas fir at 0.6% of its proportion over 30 inches, and ponderosa pine at 0.9, the highest percent of any species. That small fraction of tree accounts for almost 20% of the above ground carbon. And so then we wanted to just take a close look at just that 3% of the trees, the large trees in each of these species. So what we did was we computed how many of those trees, what proportion are between 21 and 30 inches, and what proportion are over 30 inches. For example, for Douglas fir on the left in the upper, on the chart in the upper left, you can see that about 84% of the trees, the large trees, are between 21 and 30 inches, whereas about 16% of Douglas fir are above 30 inches. And across the board, you see that pattern where many more of these trees are in that 21 to 30 inch range, to me indicating that there's a recovery going on and these trees are slowly moving up into larger diameter classes. Now, at the bottom right, you can see that the amount of carbon associated with those different proportions of trees. You can see that even though there's a lower proportion in these larger trees, it accounts for a higher proportion of above ground carbon. And that's for the fact that we've already talked about that these large trees store a lot of carbon. But still, for across all species, most of the carbon is stored in the trees ranging from 21 to 30 inches diameter at breast height. Our third question was to look at the potential consequences on carbon stores of widespread removal of large trees in east side forests, such as those shown behind you here in the Snow Basin timber sale. The most realistic way to do that was to look at an actual project. So we used the Snow Basin project, which provided a good example of what these projects could more look like in the future. Here are pictures of the Snow Basin project in the background as you've just seen. The table breaks down the large trees proposed for removal versus retention. We modeled the actual species abundances and size distributions for all large trees across the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest. And using that data, we assigned these tree species into realistic size classes by species to most accurately reflect how much carbon would be removed versus retained in each of these biophysical environments. We found that even by focusing on a specific species, you could remove as much as 35% of the above ground carbon from a given biophysical environment on up to 50 in others. Overall, we found that this project would have removed about 44% of the above ground carbon just in the large tree population. So even by focusing removals on a single species, you can have a very large impact on the above ground carbon in some of these forests. And this is, of course, in addition to all of the removals in the trees under 21 inches. So when we think about how much carbon is being removed, we must remember that this is being added to those removals already in the lower diameter distributions, which in our study we found accounted for 97% of the stems, or less than 21 inches, but account for approximately 58% of the above ground carbon. There are many other important benefits of large trees besides carbon. Our paper provides a detailed discussion of these values across the region's diverse forests. These large diameter trees become the future snags in these forests. Snags are recognized as a vital component of wildlife habitat and a necessary part of forested landscapes. Large diameter trees and snags store carbon and persist as standing snags for years, providing especially valuable wildlife habitat. Large snags provide essential habitat for many terrestrial vertebrates, including a number of species at high risk of extirpation in forests of the interior Pacific Northwest. Shown at right is a ponderosa pine snag, which provides a long-lived and persistent snag, very valuable on our landscape. Research has shown that Oregon and Washington have lost a substantial portion of forests containing large live trees and snags. And this relates back to Neil's presentation, stemming from the long-term reductions due to the heavy high-grade logging of this landscape. It takes a long time to recover. And recovery is primarily occurring on federal lands. So it just speaks to the importance of protecting some of these processes on private lands, because they're not showing much recovery on the private lands. And then, of course, when trees die and when they're infected with things like in the upper left corner, Indian paint fungus, they provide incredibly valuable wildlife habitat, as Paula has described. And grand fir, I see it a lot out in the woods and here in Northeast Oregon. These are all pictures that I've taken, and you see those habitat values all of the time. Trees used by woodpeckers, trees with fire scars because they've been there a long time, hollow logs with nests in them. It's really remarkable to experience and see firsthand all of the biodiversity associated with these grand fir trees in the forest. And then when they fall to the forest floor, they also provide incredible values. Downwood are ecologically important structures that play central roles in diverse ecosystem processes and functions such as soil development and productivity, hydrology, nutrient cycling, and habitat for fish and wildlife. Large down logs retain moisture and help maintain moist microclimates during the summer. And also in the northeast part of Oregon, as I've touched on, there's a tremendous amount of moisture that funnels through the Columbia River Gorge and just slams into the mountain ranges with all of that moisture-laden air masses. And so we get a lot of snow and rain. And here are some of those pictures. You can see some white flagging on trees there. That's because it's part of a timber sale. The only trees that will remain are the ones flagged in white. So you can see how important that is to just maintaining some of the basic functionality of this system. And these types of systems have been shown to be very important in buffering these forests of the future, for keeping them cool and moist, and the species that are associated with these forests in the face of a warming climate. I sometimes think about how important it is to keep water in a stream in the face of climate change, and don't get confused and think we need to dry out systems in preparation for climate change. In some of these very moist systems, we want to help protect their buffering and hopefully turn climate change around and give these species a refuge in the meantime. Note the overall landscape in the bottom right-hand corner. Some of these areas are just refuges in much drier, lower elevation landscapes, and they provide very unique habitats when species come out of those landscapes across these amazing elevational gradients. So our solutions here from our study, we recommend protecting and growing more large trees as the most effective near-term option for accumulating more carbon out of the atmosphere, and it will benefit other ecosystems as well. For now, we should retain the 21-inch rule. Discussions about modifying this measure should be done in an inclusive, interdisciplinary scientific framework that is not under the pressure of an imminent decision. Discussions should include all of the values of these forests to arrive at a very intelligent decision that provides the greatest benefit going forward. I tell people there's no emergency in Eastern Oregon with large trees, but we do have a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis, and these trees are helping to solve some of that. So we need to be extremely thoughtful about how we manage them. Also, we should focus forest modification and fuels reduction in the sub 21-inch trees, which we show in our study represent 97% of the stems. And in those areas, we can emphasize protections of larch, ponderosa pine, and other early seral species. We should also focus around fire adapted communities, as we know that there's a big landscape out there and we need to prioritize well. It's also essential and widely agreed that we need to manage for more wild and prescribed fires on these landscapes. It's got to become one of our primary management tools. And we'd also really consider expanding the designated reserve system, particularly in some of these incredible inventory roadless areas that, if we don't protect, fall vulnerable to many different uses over time. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you all today, and I hope you've enjoyed the talk.
Thank you to all of our panelists. And we've got a couple of questions in the chat to answer. If anyone thinks of any other questions, feel free to throw them in there. So first we have, do you think that the approach of getting areas of the east side designated forest reserves for carbon sequestration as a part of the US voluntary commitment to the Paris Climate Accord would be worth pursuing as it is for the Western stands? I'm gonna put it, panelists, you do have it visible to you, so you can
I'm wondering,
read it.
Neil, if Neil's still on there, I feel like that might be a question he's particularly well suited to answer.
Yes, I am. I think there's a very short 3-letter answer to that question, and it rhymes with guess. Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's really important to remember, the message of David's presentation is that the bulk of the carbon is in trees that are already large or soon will be large, and there's no amount of line drawing you can do on the east side that's going to capture that current sequestration and that potential sequestration. So when you think about how the United States is going to get as aggressive a reduction in net emissions as we possibly can, which also means increasing sequestration, how we're going to optimize the role of federal forests in that effort, we got to look beyond drawing lines on a map. We've got to take a look at the large trees and the soon to be large trees for their current carbon sequestration, and also for the potential that they hold to add it in the future.
I might add, I think also, the climate crisis is a very real thing happening right now, and we need to address that. But as David mentioned a few times, so is the biodiversity crisis and all these other things. And so I hope that when we consider these things, we're not just looking at carbon, that we're looking at biodiversity, wildlife, connectivity, all these other important values. And a number of us were just on a different discussion a few days ago. And I want to note that, you know, there is a bit of a bias towards the West Side, somewhat understandably, especially when it comes to carbon. But, you know, in the East Side, we're often pretty underrepresented, and a lot of bad things kind of happen out here because it's a hard place to be an outspoken conservationist. A lot of the statewide and regional groups that sort of speak for the whole state or the whole region, they're really focused on Western Oregon. You know, there's also these ideas about the rural-urban divide, many of which are not necessarily true. And then a lot of the policies come out that get sort of approved are from these sort of echo chamber collaborative groups that don't speak for a lot of the conservation community out here. So that's just as an example, when the Trump administration, you know, rolled back 3 million acres of habitat protections for spotted owls in Western Oregon, the Biden administration and Senators Wyden and Merkley jumped to address that. And then here we have a loss of protections for old growth forests and big, large trees and wildlife habitat on over 9 million acres, and it's crickets. So I think that, yeah, so anyway, Neil's answer is absolutely yes. And we need to start paying attention to more than just those lush West Side forests.
I've got to jump, and I apologize, but I have two conflicts now that I've got to go resolve. For me, this is enormously informative. I got to also say, listening to these people who are working on the ground on the East Side, hearing Rob talk about how sometimes forgotten those forests are and how few and far between the environmentalists are. It's wonderful to see you people doing this work. And it reminds me that the kind of hardship and the stresses that you operate under in the East Side breed great strength, great knowledge, great tenacity, great outcomes. I've done quite a lot of this kind of advocacy over the years. I've never worked with a better band of activists than the ones found on the East Side. And it was a great pleasure to see some of the photographs that Rob put up, where I saw, you know, the Paulus predecessors, Rob's predecessors, a great legacy, a great force. And I hope that people listening here today, if you don't know the East Side, will go visit those forests, get involved in those issues, get to meet the fabulous but few environmentalists who are there fighting for them, and help us save the other half of the Pacific Northwest. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next question, I want to make a quick reminder for anyone who is hoping to get CLE credit from this panel to fill out the form that our wonderful Beck Groff posted in the chat so that we can count your attendance. And then the next question says, in your opinion, how can a concerned resident or member of our community protect our old growth forests / trees?
Well, I'm always good at filling silence. That was supposed to be the somebody else go, but you know, I think a lot of it is the same things for any of the issues you care about, whether it's social justice, environmental justice, conservation, which is just make sure that your voice is heard. And so, like on an issue like this, we need to make sure that Senators Wyden and Merkley, who have been champions for old growth and climate, and stood up to the Trump administration on things like spotted owl habitat, that they hear from you that you care about this as well. You know, also support organizations that represent your values. And if you care about the issues we brought up, look to the organizations here, as well as that slide of the many groups that are supporting these efforts. And, you know, take those actions. Neil said it, come and see it for yourself. And then also I'd throw out, and this will be something Paula heard me say the other day as well, but is think about some of the bigger picture things. We don't have a lot of time to lose, and we're still kind of moving in the wrong direction in a lot of ways. When we really need to be taking huge steps forward. And the way that a lot of our public agencies are operating is not forward looking. It's the way they've been doing it forever. And tinkering around the edges just isn't going to be enough. We need to fully fund our Forest Service. We need the people who are making the decisions to not just have their job performance measured by how many trees they cut down and how many acres they treated or restored through restoration or through chainsaw restoration, but how many fish are coming back to the rivers, how much carbon is being sequestered in those forests, how many species have recovered, how many snags are on the landscape. And economics aren't just about how much money is going to timber executives in Lake Oswego and Idaho, but instead how many jobs are being supported locally through the recreation economy, through a higher quality of life, through ecosystem services, from actually doing real restoration work like restoring and obliterating damaging roads, repairing fish culverts, all of these other things, prescribed fire, that are providing real jobs and economic benefits. So, we need to radically be rethinking how we do things, not just tinkering around the edges. And that's not going to happen if you guys that are listening don't raise your voices.
What a fabulous answer. So we're going to do 2 more questions before we close out. The next question says, what are the main arguments used by logging proponents to try to justify cutting more large trees in Eastern Oregon? And what are your responses to these claims?
Somebody else should go first on this one.
I'll take a first stab at it, and then maybe some other folks can jump in. So generally speaking, the argument that was used to try to justify a lot of the FEA and the rollback of the protections for large trees had to do with the historical range of variability for fir, and also very much an implied historical range of variability for fire and the need to reduce fire risk. And so, I noticed the question comes from Doug Bevington, and I would say that a lot of the same responses would be some of the things that I've seen you publish and speak to in some of your work. And so the list is long, so it's kind of hard to tackle the question, but I guess, I would start with saying that there's a lot of legitimate scientific controversy around HRV, particularly in mixed conifer forests. There's a lot of concern about the focus narrowly on that rather than taking a larger ecosystem look at, say, like the needs of wildlife. There's also it's only effective for 15 to 20 years when forests are thinned. There's also the idea that I think that it makes no sense to take, even if you are on board with some of these issues, I think the idea of logging large trees especially does not make sense, because those are the ones that, one, are providing that habitat that is very rare in the landscape now, and also help to ameliorate issues like they're actually some of the most fire resistant. So and fill in, please, anybody else now jump in. There's sort of so many different levels of why this is potentially a bad idea. Like, I went into some of the water quality impacts as well, and fish. And so, I would say that at the very, very, very least, the Forest Service has really done a terrible and poor job of seriously considering and genuinely giving thought to and analysis towards some of these bigger picture issues. And initially, when this was an interim measure, the screens were the 21-inch screens, but in the initial part of that initial promise, or the initial interim measures were put into place along with a promise that there would be more holistic planning on the landscape, and that some of these bigger picture issues would be addressed and looked at, and that there would be things prioritized for consideration, such as old growth and large habitat blocks and water quality and things like this. And that's not what's happening. I hope that helps. Feel free, anybody, to jump in.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Paula, and just add that, some of the very, very practical considerations that you guys know about, of course, the fossil fuel costs of logging are very expensive and the margins are thin. And so when we've seen some projects that are very remote, far from communities outside the wild and urban interface, practically in the backcountry, the incentive becomes to offset the cost of the project. And that's very concerning, because then you're just looking at logging large trees, not for any kind of any sort of a sensible argument, but simply to offset these costs. And then another great concern I have is that temporary road building becomes more incentivized when you're kind of chasing large trees around the landscape. And we know how many roads are out there on the landscape, so much road, so much fragmentation from road building. And you're certainly not restoring anything towards natural variability with regards to roads when we have so many and you continue to build more. So I think that kind of spatial prioritization is really, really key. And we hear about a lot of talk about wildfire and the need to protect our communities. And that's why one thing I'm so impressed with some of the guys, some of my friends that do thinning on private lands around here for a living. They thin on private ground, and it's so valuable, the work they're doing around houses, around private communities. And they're also doing great forest health work. And we really need to prioritize well on the landscape if we're going to protect communities from wildfire. And that's a great concern of mine with logging large trees, is that spatially we lose track of that priority and we're not focusing on that urgent need.
And I know we're kind of eating into extra time, but I really appreciate it because I think this is important. And this question can and probably should be its own panel. I think one thing I leaned over on my desk and I came across this. It's from the 1930s. It's from the American Forest Product Industry. And I have a series of these over the decades. And what's interesting is the questions are always different. And the problems are always different. The solutions and the answers are always the same. Let's log trees. And nowadays it's restoration, forest health and restoration. But if that's the case, why don't we address the underlying problems of fire suppression, overgrazing, logging large trees, too many roads? Instead, we just want to address the state of the forest and return it to some snapshot from some photos we have in 1930, as opposed to restoring the functions and valuing the fact that a dead tree is as, if not more valuable than a living tree. That bugs and fire are not bad things that we need to stop, or it's safety and our sort of ingrained fear of fire. So then why don't we do what David was just talking about and thin small trees near communities, have better development rules, harden homes? Instead, we want to start logging these large trees in the backcountry in the name of restoration and all these things. And so, we hear these, like the East Side strategy is to increase the pace and scale of restoration. And it's only increasing the pace and scale of logging trees. So it's saying, how do we log more trees in more places and do it faster? And then somehow expect a better result than what we've been doing for decades after decade after decade. So I think one of the things is just to actually really pay attention to the euphemisms that are often being used, and just recognize that just because something's called a restoration project, it may very well not be. Why are we restoring tree densities? That's the most important thing, compositions of forest and tree densities, rather than climate and wildlife and water. So we really we need to get out of these boxes that we continue to put ourselves in.
Well, I thank you all for your very insightful answers. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up right now because another panel is gearing to use the webinar function. But I thank you all for your time and your very insightful presentations. I personally learned a lot, and I thank everyone else who stayed and viewed this panel.
Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you.